All eyes are on President Emmanuel Macron of France. He is set to address Yellow Vest protesters after facing mounting criticism for not speaking in public as the violence worsened. The embattled president will also meet trade unionists and business leaders. Now, the Yellow Vest protests are the worst rioting France has seen in decades. Some are comparing the tense atmosphere to a popular revolt. Now, Macron has already offered protesters a string of concessions, including the scrapping of further fuel tax hikes for the coming year. Now, this was a major climb down for him, as he had vowed not to be swayed by the protests. But so far, he has refused to back down on another issue that is much hated by the Yellow Vest protesters, and that is his decision to scrap a tax on the assets of France's wealthiest people. Meanwhile, French Labour Minister rejected the idea of a hike in the minimum wage, another demand by the protesters. Now, Macron had issued a plea for calm as French authorities continued to grapple with the protests. Paris prosecutor Remy Haight announced that rowdy Yellow Vest demonstrators who started debris fires in Paris will be punished. Meanwhile, Trump slammed Emmanuel Macron as he linked the protests to the Paris Agreement, to which the French foreign minister responded by saying that Trump should stay out of French internal affairs. The French finance minister, meanwhile, has said that the Yellow Vest protest is likely to severely impact the French economy as the government looks to start a dialogue with the protesters. French authorities have reportedly opened a probe into possible Russian interference behind the country's Yellow Vest protests. The probe follows reports that some social media accounts linked to Russia have targeted the movement. According to the reports, hundreds of Twitter accounts known to promote Russian views were active during the Yellow Vest protests. Russia had been criticized for using social media to influence elections in the US and some other countries as well. All right, I'm now joined by Wion's very own Elena Casas from Paris. Elena, thank you for joining us on this bulletin. Now, walk us through what is happening in Paris as we speak. Macron still to address the nation and protests continuing.
So Macron is meeting with union leaders, with his cabinet and with representatives of business at the moment at the presidential palace. He is due to address the nation, as you said, this evening, 8 p.m. local time. That's in about 6.5 hours' time. We don't yet know what he's set to announce. The government says that it will be far-ranging measures, which are aiming, of course, to end this protest movement that's now going on for a month. But as you were saying here, the government is ruling out some of the measures that the Yellow Vests have most been calling for, including a rise in the minimum wage and re-establishing that wealth tax that Macron controversially scrapped last year. So we're hearing that the announcement later could involve raising pensions, that it could involve moving up a move that's planned for later next year for a tax break on overtime work. The government is saying that it will boost ordinary people's spending power, but it does seem a little bit like they're flailing around to find measures which will stop people protesting while at the same time ruling out going too far. The Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, in particular, is worried about France's deficit and is apparently keen to remind the president that any measures that involve spending money will mean the country's deficit has to rise, something that Macron, of course, promised not to do.
Indeed, and since you mentioned that Emmanuel Macron is still to address the nation now, what else are we hearing about the protests per se? Trump has tweeted that he's worried about the situation, but French foreign minister saying, retorting back that it is none of his business to be interfering in French domestic affairs. But looking at what do you make of the alleged Russian interference in stoking the flames of the Yellow Vest protests?
Well, the French government has opened an inquiry into whether any of these Facebook and Twitter accounts that are promoting the Yellow Vest movement, particularly on Twitter, might be being run by Russian trolls. You have to bear in mind that the French government's very sensitive about Russian disinformation campaigns, particularly after Emmanuel Macron was targeted in the run-up to his election 18 months ago by a deliberate Russian disinformation campaign, or what the government described as a deliberate Russian disinformation campaign. So they are sensitive about the subject. There have been some reports suggesting that some of the Twitter accounts that are most keen to retweet Yellow Vest content, or at least to skew the international image of the Yellow Vest movement, even if the aim isn't quite so much to influence Yellow Vest protesters here in France, who are much more active on Facebook than they are on Twitter. We don't have any evidence yet, though, that those Twitter accounts are actually being backed by the Russian state, but the French government is investigating it.
Indeed, and very quickly, Elena, let's talk a bit about the Yellow Vest protests themselves. Now, they're becoming a sort of a rallying call for similar movements elsewhere in Europe. We saw the recent protests in Belgium, so to speak. So what do you make of the copycat protests happening around the world, influenced partly by the Yellow Vest protesters in Paris?
Well, these are a series of grievances that go back decades. It doesn't just relate to Emmanuel Macron's current administration and his own policies, but worries about the loss of spending power and about people not being able to get to the ends of the months and governments being deaf to the concerns of ordinary people, which go back decades here in France. There's also something very French, something very culturally specific about taking to the streets and protesting as soon as people feel that the government is ignoring them, which of course you don't find everywhere, but it is true that it's a general problem that we find all across Europe, that many people believe that governments are out of touch with ordinary people, that they are ruling only for the rich. It's not only in France that we hear those kinds of worries about people not being able to both pay their rent or their mortgage payment and eat up to the end of the months. So it has been copied a little bit in some countries, especially in Belgium, and it does in some ways reveal a fault line that you see everywhere in Europe.